Archbishop Martin and Bishop Hegarty and the Mayor of County Council, Councillor Byrne, Chocty Dalla, other members of the Oireachtas and very distinguished guests here this evening. For over 28 years now, the MacGill Summer School has been addressing themes about contemporary life in Ireland and has been tracking, if you like, those events over that period of time, starting, I suppose, in the 80s with emigration, the need to promote enterprise, the problems of unemployment, and reflecting a bit on the life and the works of Patrick MacGill and what life was like then compared to the 80s. And through the 90s, we looked at the problems that the single market and the Maastricht Treaty and so forth posed for promoting trade in Ireland, and indeed we worried quite a bit about our capacity to handle ourselves in Europe. And throughout those 20 years, Northern Ireland was a prevailing theme in this summer school. Orange and Green met here. I chaired many sessions where both representatives argued their case on each side of the table. And then we saw the great breakthrough in the last couple of years, and we celebrated with them here in Glenties. And through the early part of this decade, we searched for the soul of Ireland because we thought we had sorted the economy. And indeed, over the early years, we spoke just about whether it be 2% or 4% or 6% growth rates. And now we had other problems to contend with, how we distributed that wealth. Had we lost our identity, our sense of neighbourliness, all of the traits that characterised us here in Ireland. And we thought we were set fair for a progressive debating of these issues at MacGill for the next number of years. And then in 2007 and 2008, the world changed in a big way. And from 6% growth, we went suddenly to 1–2% contraction. And inside of the period of 2 years, we had seen the most severe and dramatic downturn the Irish economy has ever experienced, or indeed any economy perhaps has experienced, an almost 8% change in the growth pattern. And now we have the distinction, and not a very enviable distinction, of being the first EU country to declare a recession, having for 2 successive quarters been in negative growth. And suddenly we're here in Glenties asking questions we thought we'd never ask. What happened and why? And those are the questions this week that this summer school is going to address. And I'm sure tonight I'll spend a few minutes setting the scene for some of the questions that I think we, the people, need to understand. We need to share an understanding of them so that, if you like, we, the people, are involved very much in the sets of decisions that are going to shape Ireland for another generation. And clearly understanding the international context in which this happened is the first priority in some ways, because it's within that context that the solutions are going to be found. We were astonished when, if you like, what I characterize the 3 unwise men story emerged: the American subprime borrower, the Wall Street banker, and the oil-rich lender. And we wondered what this had to do with our problems until we understood that people who couldn't afford to repay mortgages were being given money hand over fist, not just for the house, but the car and the swimming pool. And the Wall Street bankers were quite happy to give out the money because they had people trying to invest money. They were exporting so much oil to these countries, they had more capital than they knew what to do with. So that was, if you like, fueling all this frenzy. No due diligence, and suddenly we had the most capable people in Wall Street dishing out money, no proper credit ratings, no proper controls, and investors dishing in the money thinking that these new vehicles, these new financial instruments, were in fact going to yield great returns. And of course, when people couldn't repay, as this went on for 10 or 15 years, We said, well, fine, the banks are in trouble, but they're working to the Basel II reserve principle, so they'll have money in reserve, which of course they didn't have because they were smart enough to keep it off the books, so that when the time came, there weren't reserves. And then they went to the Manchester United sponsors, AIG, saying, well, that's fine, our insurers will cover us. But naturally, the insurers were covering risks that might default at 10% of what was lent instead of 90%. And then suddenly we had a bank gun bust, and we had to turn to the taxpayer. And for the first time, we realized that we had mobile capital chasing a return, not in productive investment, just a return. And all the rules were broken, and indeed the whole international system of regulating the movement of capital had broken down. And what had this to do with us in Ireland? Well, of course, we were in on the Act 2. Money coming in, low interest from Europe, dished it out, same kind of rules, until we found ourselves in the same kind of trouble, expecting that this kind of building-fueled growth was going to continue forever. And then suddenly, of course, we know the rest of the story, and we find ourselves now with what we call the banking crisis and the credit crisis. And to solve this, we say, well, let's sort out the bad assets, set up this NAMA, get this sorted out and get lending again, but it's not as easy as that. Because when we talk about our advisors, the National Economic and Social Council recently turned around and said, well, that's going to be no good because there are 4 or 5 other dimensions to this problem we need to understand. There's a fiscal dimension to it. Naturally enough, when times were good, these were very tax-generating activities, so half of the money was coming into the government from the taxes on building, revenue, VAT, the lot. So we were spending about 55 billion, and no problem. And of course, we were paying ourselves on that basis. The banks felt that this kind of lending was what constituted good performance from the point of view of performance-related pay. So we started paying ourselves on the basis of this frenzied performance, and the whole cycle continued. And then we find ourselves, of course, with a major fiscal crisis, because now the taxes have dried up, and we're still spending 50 to 55 billion, but we're only taking in about 30 to 34. So now we have McCarthy looking at the need to cut public spending, because there's one thing for sure, we can't borrow anymore, and there's another thing for sure, we can't tax very much more either. So we're now stuck this week addressing the problem of how much do we cut public spending and where do we cut it. And I have a good bit of experience of the problems that this poses in a county that benefited during the boom from about 9,000 planning applications that are now running at about 2 or 2.5, and big development levies at 8 or 9 million a year that now are down at 2.5 to co-fund capital spending. And we staffed our services in order to deliver this level of activity. Now we'll be accused as we cut them back, as we will be tomorrow in the council chamber, talking about a drop of 200 in the numbers we've employed between June of last year and June of this year. Now many of them were temporary, on contracts, short term, but it does represent quite a big percentage of the total people we employed, and has huge implications for a county such as this. So that's the fiscal crisis. And as the ratepayers and those who pay water charges come in and say, you've got to cut your costs, we can't afford to pay anymore, then clearly we see there's a major problem. Either pay rates go or the numbers drop, but productivity has to increase enormously. And we have to re-engineer the way we deliver, naturally, our services. And then, of course, there's an economic crisis, the third major dimension. And the economic crisis simply was that a big percentage of the economy was built on the construction industry. It's now gone. The export-led growth that we were relying so much upon has declined quite a bit. And now, because we paid ourselves so much, we're not competitive. And now we have another problem, is to, while we're cutting public spending, how are we going to get the economy going again? Where do we look to put the stimulus and to cut the costs and all the rest of it to get going? So that's the economic crisis. The fourth that Nest mentions very clearly is the social crisis. The people who thought they had secure pensions, but now they don't, because they were the investors who were buying these instruments and taking shares and all the rest of it. And now they find that their pension fund is gone and their incomes are being washed away, and they're pretty angry. And then there are those on welfare payments who are quite concerned that they're going to be cut as part of this, and they're pretty angry. They don't want to be the ones. And yet we're finding it hard to pay the wages that we paid before in order to stay competitive, and now we're wondering, are we paying people more to be on welfare than we can afford to pay them when they're working? So we have some significant social problems. And tied into that, obviously, is the whole question of equality and the whole value system on which we're going to sort out these problems and on which we're going to try and share an understanding. And the final problem, and it's not the only problem I think that's left to mention, is the reputational one. Because if the people who lend us money aren't convinced that we know what we're doing, then it's going to cost us a lot to buy the bonds in Europe as we try to sort this out within the European and perhaps within the global context. We've got to convince them that we have a strategy to sort this out if we're going to basically get bailed out. Or perhaps that dramatic statement from the Professor of Economics in UCD that we're on an unstoppable decline into bankruptcy is not so dramatic after all. So we're fighting for our reputation, and that reputation will be built on how we handle this. So there's a huge political agenda emerging, quite clearly, and a new paradigm needed. Because we fought with one another and we lobbied that we weren't going to be the ones to take the cut. We couldn't rationalise our health services over 40 years because nobody wanted to rationalise anything. We wanted things to stay as they are. And many interest groups and professional groups were putting forward these arguments, and they were masquerading as if they somehow were on behalf of the patients. So there's a lot we're going to have to face up to politically in terms of party political, interest group and parochial allegiances, if in fact we're going to find a new paradigm where the common good and the values on which a just society are built is the way forward. I commend the organisers this week, Joe and his team, on picking a topic that is so relevant. I think it's the first time in this kind of forum, as opposed to being in the Dáil chamber or perhaps across in the media, that people have sat down in a neutral venue to debate these questions, and he has some of the most distinguished speakers in the country who are at the forefront of trying to solve these problems here during the week. I hope tonight I've prompted perhaps some of the questions we should address to them, some of the debates we need to engender, if in fact we're going to begin on the road to recovery. Thank you very much.